You tonight for what is the second of three speaker series that we are holding in terms of looking at what the future of our city, the wonderful city of Wellington, looks like into the future. I welcome each of you and thank you for your participation. I just want to do a little bit of housekeeping first, if I may, before I introduce our Mayor, Justin Lester, and also get into the main proceedings, which is listening to the amazing lineup that we have tonight before you. Just in terms of health and safety, in the unlikely event of a fire alarm, please exit this room in the exits behind you, out of the auditorium, exit into the Civic Plaza, and towards the City to Sea Bridge where there is the blue mat and gather there. If in the unlikely event of an earthquake, you all understand to duck, cover and hold, and then follow the directions of the wonderful City Gallery staff. Those staff are also first aid trained, so if in the event of any other first aid emergency, please make yourself known to them. Lastly, toilets are also outside in the main foyer, so again, just outside through the doors that you came in, and the toilets are just out there, and follow the signs. As I said, my name is David Chick, and I am the Chief City Planner at Wellington City Council. And the reason we are gathered here today is that the wonderful city of Wellington has a number of amazing opportunities, but a number of challenges before us. We have an amazing opportunity at this point in time to shape the direction of this amazing city that we call Wellington. It is a place that I now call home after 3 years, after arriving from across the ditch, from a small island off the coast of New Zealand, which is often known as Tasmania. For those who may know Tasmania, I come from Hobart, and Hobart has a lot of similarities to Wellington. So as soon as I arrived in Wellington, I felt at home. I feel even more at home, given the tragic events of last week as well. The welcome, the people of New Zealand. I am so proud to be able to call myself now a Kiwi. I also would like to, as a result of that, recognise all those that have suffered so tragically in those events as well. As I mentioned, Wellington has a number of challenges that we are facing. I've mentioned one of them, some of the seismic risks that we are facing. Just this week on Tuesday, we took the important and almost required decision to close the Central Library as a result of the concerns that we have from a seismic event. We take safety and security of both staff and also the community very, very seriously. But these are real issues. These are real challenges. We've seen in the paper the issues around insurance, and insurance companies insuring companies and also residential homes in Wellington. These are some of the seismic challenges that we need to grapple with. We also need to consider sea level rise and climate change and the impact that that is going to have on future generations and the way that we plan our city. The other thing that we are very much focused on here tonight is how we also respond to population growth. Population growth is coming, and I sort of hesitate, given that we have Liz McPherson here, to start quoting numbers in terms of the stats that we are considering that we are facing over the next 30 or so years. We are estimating anywhere up to, did you like that sort of precursor, anywhere up to 80,000 people who over the next 30 years is wanting to call Wellington home. Just to put that into perspective, but before I go there, can I get a raise of hands of how many people came to the last speaker series? We've got a couple. So you've heard this before, but don't switch off. So 80,000 people to be accommodated in the next 30 years. Can I get a show of hands of how many Kororians we have in the audience? We've got a couple. Now, I'm not picking on you, but just to put this into perspective, 80,000 people equates to upwards of 6 Kororis over the next 30 years. Korori is one of the largest suburbs in all of New Zealand, just to put that into perspective. So where and how we grow is really, really important. And tonight's speakers are really focusing on how we respond to these challenges, including the population growth that we have before us. So without further ado, I would like to introduce our Mayor, Justin Lester, to the podium to say a few words, and I will then introduce our speakers and give you a rundown of the proceedings tonight. Thank you, Justin.
Tēnā koe, David. Ngā mihi nui kia koutou katoa. Nau mai haere mai piki, mai kake, mai whakatau, mai kia ora te whānau. Great to see you all. Assalamu alaikum. And good evening, everyone. Thanks for taking the time to come out tonight. Another beautiful evening in paradise in this fortunate place that we live in Wellington. Look, I just want to start by talking about Wellington, the context, and how this place has changed over the last 30 years. And I also want to thank our panellists for being here to talk about its future. Now, who lived in Wellington in the early 1990s? Quite a few of you? Good. You will have noticed, therefore, how much has changed and how considerable that change has been. I think back to the Wellington in the 1990s, the airport was just a hangar. It was actually literally a hangar, a very basic shed that people arrived in at our airport. You came into the CBD, there was no life whatsoever. After hours, everybody sort of went off to their dormitory suburbs. Public servants wore 3 shades of beige. There wasn't a tourism destination to speak of in Wellington. People would pop through, perhaps pop up to the cable car, jump on a ferry and head down to the South Island, their actual destination. No one really wanted to stay here. It was incredibly hard to even get Tourism New Zealand, the then Tourism Board, to get people to come to Wellington. We've changed enormously in the last 30 years. Some of our dormant CBD streets have now become our liveliest streets. And look, I love going out there any day of the week these days, and there's always life. The laneways have come to life. And a whole lot of people are now more than 20,000, approaching 25,000. Liz will probably tell me I'm wrong, but living in our CBD. And that's brilliant because it's also meant that we've become the lowest carbon emitter per capita of any city in Australasia as well. But what I want to stress is none of these things have happened by chance. They've happened by design and by good decisions and good management. We've created a city that's based on events and culture and the arts. We've also focused on having a CBD that's dense, that people can live in, that doesn't require to have car parks for new apartment construction, for example. We could, like other cities, Auckland is one, where it has focused more around spread and urban sprawl. And that may have changed more recently in its unitary plan. But Wellington is focused on trying to keep that dense urban form. And we've got to make sure we continue to make those decisions. What are we doing as a council? Well, just today we've signed off on the first stage of our zero carbon plan to make Wellington a zero carbon city by 2050. What we know is the vast proportion of our emissions as a city come in 2 forms, transport and stationary energy. That's where we can make the most difference in a short space of time. We also know that if we make decisions around sprawl, that's going to affect both of those, that people are going to spend more time in cars travelling in and around the city to get from place to place. It'll lead to more congestion and make it harder for people to get around as well. So we're focused on these critical decisions right now. We know that if we make them now, it's going to influence the way the city develops for the next 50 years. So we want to make sure we get it right. Well, I appreciate your time. I thank you for being here. I thank you for the contributions that you make, because I also want to strongly stress that we are not the sole arbiter of ideas. We collect our ideas from our communities and from Wellingtonians, and that helps us in the decisions we make. So thank you for your time, thank you for your presence. Kia ora.
Thanks, Justin. Just also like to advise, you may have noticed there is a camera up in the top of the auditorium. We are live streaming and also recording the proceedings of these so that you and others can see the speakers at their own leisure as well. We are also seeking questions from the audience as well. So as the speakers are going through what they have to say, really put your mind to any of the questions you may want to ask. So without further ado, what we'd like to do is introduce Liz. I would also like to, in the interest of time, give most of the time to the speakers. So I won't read all of the bio information. You should have that in your folders and your handouts. So please refer to that. So without further ado, I'll introduce Liz McPherson, who is a government statistician. Is that your official title? The government, not just a government statistician, the government statistician. Thank you, Liz.
Kia ora koutou. Assalamu alaikum. It's great to be here tonight. Yes, I am the government statistician. We have plenty of statisticians at Stats New Zealand, but only one that's called the government statistician. It's wonderful to be here. I've lived in Wellington for 30 years, and I call it home. I came from Auckland, and I've raised my children here. I've lived in Miramar, and I've lived all over Wellington actually. In Newtown and areas around there, and now in Miramar for 13 years, and now in Wadestown. I've seen it change. And I want to talk to you a bit about Wellington by the numbers, is what I've called this presentation. If this will click through, I'll just check. Yeah. What I want to do is start off by talking about where we are now, and then I want to give you a bit of a sense of where we think we're going from a population perspective, and some other things as well. So I've got lots of slides. One of the things about working in Stats NZ, you have lots of numbers, so I'm actually going to whiz through a lot of them if I think that we've pretty much covered things. You can see up here on the screen, this is where we are now. We've got an estimated population at the moment of around 2016, 216,000, and that's up 9.6% from 2013. And the population of Wellington City has grown by about 3,600 people since 2017, based on our estimates. Now, this population pyramid, age-sex pyramid, is a pretty standard one for New Zealand cities. It basically, the age structure is typical because net migration, arrivals minus departures, basically drive a younger age structure for New Zealand cities. Large urban areas attract young migrants from other areas of New Zealand and from overseas, often seeking work or tertiary education. So this is a pretty typical of a New Zealand city. Median age for Wellington residents is 33. Larger portion of people in the population are in the younger age groups, which lowers the median age for the population. For New Zealand as a whole, we're sitting around 36, 37. Youngest age, median age in New Zealand for a city is actually Hamilton, which is around 32. Now, this is a population age pyramid. On the dark green is 2018 in terms of our population. And then on the teal side is 2043, based on a medium projection. Medium basically means medium everything, medium births, medium deaths, medium migration. And you can see the changes that we're coming through there in terms of the older population, which is likely to grow fastest in the future in most New Zealand areas, including Wellington. And it also reflects the influences of births and migrations and deaths, obviously. The baby boomers will be aged 78 to 97 years in 2043. Conversely, actually, the number of younger people is actually staying relatively stable. It declines slightly, but relatively stable in most areas. Now, this next lot of information comes from our general social survey, so it's telling you something. It's telling you something about how people are feeling in Wellington. Life satisfaction for people in Wellington in general is pretty good. If you look at the comparison between the light blue is Wellington and the dark blue is New Zealand as a whole, how people are feeling based on our social survey. This is what they're saying about adequacy of income to meet everyday needs. Again, from that perspective, Wellingtonians are more likely to say that they had enough money for everyday needs than some of the rest of New Zealand. But they do acknowledge that they have some problems with housing quality. So most common problems that they talk about, 18.9% of people in Wellington say their house is often or always colder than they would like. And there are also some figures on repairs and maintenance and things, but that's the most common problem described in terms of housing issues. On to more information about population projections, as we were talking earlier. You can see the dark black line is our estimated resident population for Wellington City, and then in terms of our population projections. And you're quite right, if you go with the highest population projection, you're talking about 80. If you're talking by 2043, 80,000. If you're talking the median population, you're sitting more around just over 50. Interestingly enough, when you look at your population projections for Wellington, actually the annual average rate of population change was projected to peak in the 5 years ending 2018. So we're still going to actually have population growth, but not as fast as it has been. Now, this is a picture of Wellington City. And this is looking at population change between 2018 and 2043. So you're talking about negative change and positive change. And the reason why we've got the bigger intervals towards the end, my staff have told me, is that the rate of growth is much greater than the rate of decline. So if you had an even split, we wouldn't be able to show you much on the graph, but based on the map. But what you can see there is that we've got a large part of Wellington where you're going to have growth of between 10 and 50% in terms of your percent change. Now the dark green areas, for those of you who can't recognise them, are in the north in particular are Glenside North, Churton Park North, Granada Village, Takapu, Horokiwi, Woodridge, and these are area unit levels, names for these areas. And the dark purple area, where we're showing a 10% decrease in terms of percent change, is Nauranga East, and the much smaller one is Evans Bay Marina. It just gives you a sense of the sorts of changes that we're likely to see over that period of time. Ethnic populations for the Wellington City area over time, effectively the ethnicities obviously grow as the population grows, but one of the things to note there is that the Asian population is projected to grow at a faster rate than the other ethnicities, as it's driven largely by net migration, which was more volatile than natural increase. And this one, I think I'll flick through quite quickly, but essentially what this is saying is that in terms of net migration, that's people, migration internally within New Zealand and from overseas. The dark green is basically the historical net migration. We're currently sitting at the higher end in terms of our migration assumptions, but it's worthwhile noting that New Zealand has experienced some really large fluctuations in net migration, so we had really significant gains between 2002 and 2006, and currently between 2014 and 2018, but much, much smaller migration gains between 1997 and 2001 and 2007 and 2013. And our population projections assume that future national net migration will fluctuate between these historic levels, but of course, migration is a pretty difficult thing to pick. And is influenced by all sorts of things that are happening both domestically and internationally. So, interesting thing to note in terms of predicted population and household change, this graph is showing change in population. Is to note that that just because you get a decrease in the amount of population change, i.e. increase, doesn't mean that you necessarily need less. So the proportionate decrease in the amount of houses you need doesn't necessarily follow. And the reason for that is that you end up with, whether you have an ageing population, more people are moving into older ages where they're less likely to live in situations where they have larger families. So they might still want to have a house, however, and have a household. So you just need to think about the fact that a projected slight decrease in population, you might actually even have a projected increase in households if people are choosing to actually live alone or live just as a couple. So it does reinforce the importance of population projections around the changing age structure as well as total changes in numbers. Right, a few things about what's going on in terms of housing costs. Those of you who live in Wellington who have been looking to buy a house or sell a house will know that the mean house value in Wellington has changed significantly. So there's been a 7.2% percentage change in the mean house value between September 2017 and 2018. The mean house value in Wellington City in the year to September 2018 is around $750,000. And in terms of weekly rent, the estimated mean weekly rent in Wellington City for the year to December 2018 is $515. And there's been around about 6% increase in the estimated mean weekly rent in Wellington City between the year to December 2017 and 2018. And this just gives you a sense of what's going on in the background in terms of consenting. Building consents reflect an intention to build. So you can see over time, the blue line is the number of houses. You've got apartments in there as well as the orange line. The yellow line is townhouses. So just interesting to see that in terms of Wellington region, the growth is still dominated in terms of new dwellings is dominated by standalone houses. Multi-unit dwellings like townhouses and apartments have become more popular in recent years, but it's still a relatively small proportion of the total, which is something to bear in mind. Now I just want to quickly flick before I end onto regional growth and GDP. So these are the figures that we just put out the other day for regional GDP for Wellington. So you can see that Wellington has got 13% of New Zealand's GDP here. I can tell you that GDP per capita is the highest in Wellington of anywhere in New Zealand, sitting there at 71,000. And you can see the change in GDP over the period from 2013 to 2018. And then to just give you a sense of the sort of the areas, sectors of industry that are contributing to that, and therefore will give you a little bit of a sense of the sort of jobs involved as well, and occupations involved. There you can see it's largely, the growth is in professional and technical, scientific and technical services. That's the blue line there. Interesting as a public servant to see the yellow line, See how it's increasing there, and then this is where we have a cap put on the public service. It flatlines there. At the same time, we see an increase in the technical services being purchased. And then issues associated with the financial and insurance services here, which is we've seen over time movement of head offices and within New Zealand and offshore. So some final things from me though. I mean, I've been showing you things which most of you might well say, well look, Liz, I've seen that all before. And I think one of the things we need to actually think about is new and different sources of data that are actually going to give us a different picture, are going to allow us to have some real-time information about flows, about what's going on within Wellington and within New Zealand as a whole. And we within Stats New Zealand, and I know within the council, are looking at how we make better use of things like cell phone data to give us a sense of population density and travel flows. We've actually got Drew Broadley here, who's the director of the Data Ventures team at Stats New Zealand. We're working on a product there at the moment that will be looking at population density using cell phone information. But I think as well we need to think about how Wellington is going to function from that perspective of connectivity and digital transformation. How are we actually going to make the best possible use of the ability to work remotely and other things in order to be able to make Wellington a really livable city? How are we going to make the most of that? But how are we going to think about that from the point of digital inclusion as well? Travel and transport, some interesting figures for you to just ponder here. One of the great things about being at Stats New Zealand is I've got all sorts of interesting data at my fingertips, one of which is imports of electric vehicles. So I can tell you that in terms of electric cars, we've had a major increase in the spending on that. So, and in terms of e-bikes and scooters, which is topical, between the 2008 calendar year, in the 2008 calendar year, there was $32.2 million worth of e-bikes and scooters imported. In the 2018 calendar year, anyone willing to hazard a guess as to how much? 52 million on e-bikes and scooters. The other thing we need to bear in mind is how we're going to be using things like AI and algorithms in terms of the way that we conduct our work, the way we live our lives, and how that can both improve our lives and also the things that we will need to manage there in terms of challenges going forward, which feeds into the notion of the future of work and how we make the very best of the talent that we have available to us through using some of the new technology that we have. How can we make sure that that new technology actually does help give us the quality of life that we are after and adds value as well as some of the other things that it could bring us. From my perspective, I look at new technology as a real opportunity, but at the same time, we have to make sure that we're using it and building trust and confidence at the same time. So, having left you with those thoughts, I'm going to finish now.
Thank you, Liz. I was actually just wondering with some of your final remarks if you attended council committee meeting today, because not only did we sign off some changes around the e-scooter policy and the process there, but we also, committee signed off on about a dozen electric vehicle charges in our centres and also in the suburbs. So I was just wondering if you had been spying on that as well. I'm not the spy agent.
Just
the government statistician.
Yeah.
In light of that, one of the other things that struck me was certainly the median age. You've certainly made me feel very old in regards to that median age. But as the chief statistician, I'm interested in what you would say to me as the chief city planner. In regards to when I was looking at the chart around the consenting, one of the anomalies there seemed to be the retirement village consents when you look at the chart related to an ageing population. What would you say about that?
Well, I guess from that perspective, I do think planning around, so this is something we can plan for. We know it. It's not like the fluctuations that we get from migration, for example. We've actually got the ability to plan for this. I made the point earlier that we need to think about households and the fact that we need as a city to be catering for those who want to live alone, but we also need to be thinking about the retirement villages. So my encouragement would be to be thinking about how we offer a variety of different ways of life for those of us who are, by 2043, I'll be needing something like this. And as I say, it's not something that should be taking us by surprise. So what is it that means that we're not seeing the consenting in there for retirement villages? And as you say, I mean, does it say something about some of the constraints? Does it say something about some of the other information that's available to people?
And from a social perspective, that ability to choose where you live and be able to actually age in place and within the community in which you enjoy so much is really important. Any questions from the audience? We have a roving mic by Diane. Any questions? Someone break the ice. Thank you.
Roger Tweedy,
Hey, Roger, good to see you.
one stat that surprised me, I've always said Wellington had the most 20-year-olds in the city of New Zealand, but you're saying it's
Yeah,
so
it shifted, yeah, that's right.
The other one is the aging one, and I wouldn't like people to think, being one of the older here, that we all want to go into retirement.
No.
I'm sure that's not what you were
No, that's not. I was suggesting you wanted choice.
I went to a program in Australia where they took a suburb like Seaton, which had a lot of big houses with widows and actually found ways of filling the house up, if you like, with students kind of thing. So I think there's a whole lot of innovative programs you can do around ageing, not just building gated communities of oldies.
No, I think the point I was making, Roger, was that we actually need choice. So retirement villages for those who want them, but some people want to live alone, some people may well like to have an extended family essentially move in with them. So need to find ways through that.
Great. Thanks for the question. Any further questions? All right. A final round of applause for Liz. Thank you. Our next speaker is Victor Komarovsky, who is speaking on a carbon neutral future. Thanks, Victor.
See what slide comes up.
Kia ora tātou. Can you hear me okay? So my name's Victor Komarovsky and I'm speaking on behalf of Generation Zero. We've got a few people from Generation Zero in the room, so thanks for coming. And I'm speaking about a carbon neutral future, but I would just like to take a minute to reframe that for a second because this assumes that a carbon neutral future is an option, is something that we can choose to take. But I'm going to put it to you actually that there is no option. Carbon neutrality is something that we must achieve if we're to do our part to save humanity from climate change. And actually, climate change is already happening, and to a large degree, we're going to have to work out how to live with it. So that is our future, so I would like to talk to you about our future. But as I said, I'm from Generation Zero, so I'll just talk about them for a wee while first. So we're a movement of youth, obviously, who we're a movement of youth who believe that New Zealand will be better off when we're independent from fossil fuels, and that's us up there on the top left. Well, that's some of us at a hui in Wellington. We have a lot of fun. Sometimes we do things like on the top right-hand corner, we get involved with deep policy discussions. That's a few of our volunteers at the Blue Greens Forum last month with the National Party, talking about a range of policies around decarbonisation and other environmental policies. Sometimes we organise the community to have a voice. In this case, on the bottom left-hand corner, we've got a couple of volunteers sending an open letter to Jacinda Ardern that was signed by about 150 of Jacinda's constituents in Mount Albert, calling for a climate change plan. And sometimes, like on the bottom right-hand corner, we just, do weird stuff like dress up as a bus and show up to public meetings about buses. That was such an awkward meeting, you could have cut the tension with a knife. So it was really great to see everyone's response when we walked in of being sort of, we brought a lot of joy to people in that meeting. Yep. One of the things that we have been working on a lot in the last few years is the Zero Carbon Act, and for those of you who don't know what that is, it's a law and a plan to tackle climate change. And I won't go into the details here. This is a photo of me. This is probably the best day of my life, actually. We had a bunch of volunteers cycle from Auckland down to Wellington. One of them's in the room here. And when they arrived in Wellington, about 100 cyclists met them and cycled up to Parliament, and I had the honour of leading those cyclists up to the front steps of Parliament on this tall bike, carrying a giant symbolic Zero Carbon Act scroll. So I guess our unique combination of policy focus, being solutions focused, being young people contributing policy solutions, and also our ability to organise communities has meant that we have contributed quite a lot of success, as well as lots of other organisations, particularly around the Zero Carbon Act. This is a headline from last week. The Zero Carbon Bill, the draft law, is 95% of the way there, so this year we will see a Zero Carbon Act put into place. The significance of that is that this law will guide New Zealand to carbon neutrality by 2050. Something that's come out of all of this advocacy work over the last few years is a huge change in the conversation around climate change. And I hope lots of people in this room agree that the conversation is so much better, particularly in our politics. If we look back a few years ago, 2014 or 15, this is Bill English saying, climate change is a non-issue because there are more pressing concerns. This is Bill English talking about the greatest challenge to have ever faced humanity. Whereas now Simon Bridges, the leader of that same political party, openly supports a bipartisan approach to tackling climate change and considers it one of the key issues for the National Party. And so that's awesome. We've come a real long way, and it's down to civil society advocating and making our voices heard. And I love that we're having this discussion at a national level. But what I will agitate on here is that I don't hear it very much in Wellington. I don't hear enough people screaming from the rooftops, screaming from the streets that climate change is an emergency and we need to act now. But who is screaming? It's youth, of course. It's always youth. They've been doing it for a while now, but as we saw last Friday, you probably couldn't have missed them. Thousands of youth marched down Lambton Quay calling for action on climate change, and they joined about 1.5 million students all around the world in over 125 countries. So they're incredible, and they give me hope. The thing that I want to point out here is that we don't give young people any power to dictate their future. These are the people that are going to inherit climate change, and we give them no power to influence the decisions that we make now. So what do? They get together and they create power by banding together and marching like this. And I'm so inspired by them. And I won't bore you with too much detail about climate change because I think it's pretty well agreed upon now, but just a recap of where we're at. So right now we're at 1 degree warming, so we've warmed 1 degree above the baseline temperature that essentially all of humanity's ever known. And the impact of that is quite a lot, actually. I could show you images of tens of thousands of dead flying foxes which died in the recent droughts in Australia, or I could show you 100,000 people displaced as a result of a cyclone. But actually, this is just my hometown in Nelson last year. After Cyclone Fahey hit, I used to bike along that little path there. And, you know, not just a year later, actually this was last month, I was in Nelson at my mother's home and I looked out the back window and I saw the hillside on fire. It was one of 4 fires, one of which is the largest fire that we've had in living memory. So Nelson's been hit, you know, my home has been hit with 2 different sources of natural disaster exacerbated by climate change. And that's just at 1 degree, that's just right now. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change tells us that we will rise to 1.5 degrees warming in a matter of maybe a decade, perhaps by 2030. So what does that look like? I mean, 1.5 degrees, it's going to be catastrophic, and some people are talking about a higher temperature than that, which I think is totally unacceptable. The thing is, we know what it looks like. This is a screenshot from a Wellington City Council plan that I think was discussed today. It shows Wellington City at 1.4 metres sea level rise, which is a plausible long-term effect of 1.5 degrees warming. You can see that, I don't know if I've got a laser here, but you can see we're right here. So in this future scenario, if we had this meeting, we would have to swim here. So yep, we know what 1.5 degrees looks like, and it is an emergency. The thing that gets me about this image is that the blue water looks kind of, I don't know about you, but it looks soothing and still and almost like paradise. But it's not like that, is it? We know what it looks like. It's kind of grey and murky and it's filled with your most valued possessions. That's what it looks like. So we need to change, obviously. And we need to both adapt and become carbon neutral. So I'll talk first about adaptation. This is taken directly out of a resource from C40 Cities. So they're a network of cities leading the policy work on how to decarbonise and how to adapt to climate change. And so this is their Adaptation Summary. And it talks a little bit about stuff that we kind of have to do now, and we're doing already. It's basic adaptation stuff like improving our infrastructure, and I know Wellington City Council is working really hard to improve our infrastructure around coasts, to make it more resilient to storm surges and things like that. That is happening now. Flood protection, there's a great new seawall over at Island Bay. That work is being done right now. The things that we're probably not doing and not talking about is this deep systemic change that requires reconfiguration of social and ecological systems. Those are big words, aren't they? Big and scary words. What does that mean? So alternative lifestyles and employment. It seems ridiculous. What does alternative lifestyles and employment mean? Does it mean, not living in a lovely villa in Seatoon because it's inundated with water? Does it mean not flying? Probably. What about this one here? New city planning to safeguard people and infrastructure. These are they're sort of lukewarm words, but the picture here is like literally floating buildings. It's literally an image out of Waterworld. So I think the scariest thing about this slide is that we have these sort of euphemism words that sound a bit lukewarm, but actually what we're talking about here is a crisis. And we are just not putting this into plain English. And our councils, I'm sorry to say, are not putting this into plain English so that we can talk about it. But what I'm here actually to talk about is going carbon neutral. So let's talk about some of those things that we need to do. So here's from the same resource from C40 Cities. Here are some of the things that cities can do to decarbonise. And down the left-hand side here, you've got land use and urban planning, and actually that's sort of the context of this meeting here. You've also got things like switching to electric transport, sharing schemes, car sharing schemes, public transport and active transport, and making our buildings lower energy. So they're all basic stuff, so let's work through it quickly. Land use and urban planning. Well, I mean, the long story short is that cities all around the world who are doing this policy development are saying that there can be no more urban sprawl. Urban sprawl will increase our emissions, and if we want any hope of reducing them, there can be no urban sprawl. So that's the long short of that one. In terms of these transport options for us to reduce emissions, I know the Wellington City Council is doing a lot of good work around electrification, and it sounds like you've signed off 12 new electric charging points, so that's great. And there's been some awesome work going on for a few years now around car sharing schemes. We've got one really great provider that's really boomed in the last few years and is taking cars off the road and making a better solution for people to share cars. But the thing that I'm disappointed on is these two here, public transport and non-motorised transport. So what I didn't point out is that the darker the squares here means the easier it is to get it done from an economic, technological point of view, so on and so forth. So it's dark for public transport. It is the easiest solution we can take, is to improve our public transport. And I know Wellington City Council isn't directly responsible for our public transport, but you sure as heck have a big influence on that, and I think much more needs to be done. We have this opportunity with Let's Get Wellington Moving to fully transform our public transport and our active transport to make it a low-carbon city that's connected and it's accessible for everyone. And we need to be taking this opportunity because it will not come up again, and it literally is the easiest thing that we can do. And the next thing is low and zero energy buildings, and I won't get into that too much. I know there's been some good work refitting old buildings with great technology to make them low emissions, so that's good. So I'll just recap on what Wellington City Council can do. Stop sprawl. There can be no new greenfield site, none. That's just a fact of the matter. We know where the good quality land is in Wellington, that is above the sea level rise zones, and we know that we can use that. This brings up a tension of character homes and wanting to preserve old character homes, but I ask everyone here, are we asking ourselves the right questions, and are we treating climate change like the crisis it is? The image I have in my head is how characterful remove floorboards when the sea is coming through it. The next thing we can do is boldly back active and public transport. We have the opportunity. No more lukewarm words. We actually have to do this, and we have to give our constituents the benefit of the doubt by telling them what an emergency this is so that they can come on board and they can have time to accept the new solutions around cycleways, around reducing parking, some of those difficult conversations to be had, but we need to be using strong words that illustrate the importance of these decisions. Yeah, let's prioritize the right projects. There are a couple of projects that spring to mind where a lot of money has been poured in recently, and I'm not saying that they're not important, but I am saying that climate change is a crisis, and we need to be spending all of our money on fixing this crisis. And listen to the right people. Again, young people have been excluded from the conversation forever, and equally so have Māori, so have people with disabilities, of which a quarter of the population self-identify. Those people need to be not only listened to, I use the wrong language here, not only listened to, but they actively need to be making the decisions if we're to have the city that we want in the future. So in summary, it's act like climate change is an emergency, because it is. This image just quickly sums up my whole presentation. Some of you might recognize your children in this photo, seriously. But here we go. So we've got 12 years left. It's actually just slightly less than 12 years to reduce our emissions by half, and before 1.5 degrees is upon us, and before we've got a lot of those bad things coming in. 12 years, that's nothing. You know, I'll be 25. I'm not joking. Justin Lester will be in his mid-50s. You know, that's no time at all. So we actually need to get onto it. It's only like 4 election cycles, right? Go zero carbon. yeah, I mean, this is obvious. We just need to make it happen, and we need to make it happen quickly. Let's ramp up those targets and let's start taking meaningful action. And that's directed at the council. So for those of you who don't recognise that this is a council building, you have an active role to play in this. No more lukewarm words. Let's actually start taking this seriously. Include people, include young people, include people who need to be in the conversation who haven't already. If you don't, we'll be here and we'll get louder. So that's me. That's it.
Thanks, Victor. Fantastic. And you're absolutely right. It is actually all about the people. This is something that we can't tackle by ourselves. We need everyone to be a part of what that future looks like. I must sort of pick up on one of the images you mentioned, your bus example when you were going into the meeting. Just like to say you almost ran me over when I attended.
Oh, I'm sorry about that.
Just kidding. There's been a lot of discussion about the cost and rhetoric about the cost of carbon, and of course the counter to that is the cost of not doing anything about it. What about the value, the economy of a no or zero carbon future? Can you tell us more about that? Can you tell us what role a place like Wellington could have in that future?
Yeah, I loathe to talk about an economic frame at all because this is our livelihoods at stake. But what I will say is that Wellington has the highest median income of any city in New Zealand. We already have the lowest per capita emissions. It's a great city. We are by far and away the best placed to lead New Zealand on decarbonisation. Not just follow the trend that we need to as dictated by international policy or international research, actually lead that trend because we need to be doing more so that others who don't have the same capacity as us can have a little bit more wiggle room. And I think there's huge amounts of value in leading and showing the rest of the country that it can be done and that we can thrive within that.
Great, thanks, Victor. Any questions? Just a question over here. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Conley. I'm currently a master's thesis student in environmental studies at Vic, and like you, I hold pretty much all of the same convictions. One of the questions I have is, given the understanding of climate change and what will happen if no action is made, one of the fears I hold is that if we're going to be making those kind of significant cuts in emissions, oftentimes I think issues like equity and societal distributional impacts often fall by the wayside. And I'm wondering, how do we ensure that things that are well-intentioned, like a higher fuel tax, will not have the regressive impacts that could come about if we don't think about these other factors?
Yeah, thanks so much for raising that. The short answer is I don't know how to answer that broadly, but the long answer is that we need to be talking about climate change in the severity that it actually exists so that we can open up the discussion more broadly to people who haven't quite clocked the urgency and who then come into the conversation. Secondly, we do need to be taking really active steps to get those people into the room, not just sending out an invite and hoping they'll come, because at the end of the day, it's usually the same people that come. I note that it's almost the same crowd this week as it was last week, which is great. But we need to also be doing active things to get new people into the room so that they can be having the conversation. Yeah, I mean, those are the first two things. It's such a complex issue, and we need to keep it front of mind all the time.
Final question for Victor, just in the back.
I didn't get a sense that we're actually as worried as we should be. You gave a good presentation, but there's an absence of passion from our local government and our central government leaders. If this is the crisis, we know it is, then
I assume that was a question for Justin.
We should have come to our meeting today. This, and what we said to our officers was this isn't ambitious enough. So we sent it back and set up a working committee to make sure we're doing more in the city. And I take it on board. What I do say is, to those previous generations going, we've left us in this mess. We're trying to do things as fast as we can. I started on the council in 2010. I was the youngest councillor in at 32. I'm still the youngest councillor. So we need the likes of you to stand up here elected. Because you know what I'm fighting? An average age of about 58 to 60 who vote against these documents, won't install 16 EV chargers in the city, don't want any cycleways, and won't remove a single bloody car park. So that's what we're fighting. We're actually fighting against Wellingtonians. When I first started on council, we invested 80 grand a year in cycleways in the city. We're now doing, I think, 73 million over 10 years. Look, we're making considerable change, but we're fighting against ourselves.
So glad Justin is here tonight. It's great. Thank you very much, Victor. A final round of applause for Victor. Now, we've talked a little bit about the stats, the numbers that we're dealing with in terms of population growth. Now we want to turn our mind to how we achieve that, not just from a numbers perspective, but also from a quality perspective. We need to make sure that the housing that we provide is warm, safe and dry. Without further ado, we'd like to hear from Pamela Bell from Prefab NZ.
Hi folks. I know we're near the end of a long day, so I'm quite happy to have more of a conversation. So if anyone's got questions or comments along the way, feel free to jump in, yeah? Kia ora koutou, of course. Thanks for your precious time this evening. Look, I come from Prefab NZ. We're a non-profit industry association in the construction or the built environment industry. We have nearly 400 members, excuse me, and our front door looks like that. Our membership is spread throughout the country and our roles are spread throughout the built environment. So designers, architects, engineers, manufacturers, construction professionals, you name it. Anyone that touches a built environment project is part of our membership. And we're united by being interested in innovative construction, which basically means a manufacturing approach to construction. Now, when we set up an industry association 9 years ago, we didn't know about any of the rules, so we decided to just get on and just get some stuff done. So when Christchurch had their first earthquake, literally 6 months after we got going, we thought, oh, right, what are we going to do here? And when the Department of Building and Housing said they wanted to put out a tender for houses that were going to last 10 years, we thought, oh crap, prefab's going to get brushed with that temporary, crappy brushstroke again. So we went out with Christchurch Council and did the Hive, a home innovation village, and that was up for 2.5 years and demonstrated 10 different prefabricated housing types. We've done another lot of projects, I guess, a couple that stand out. The Kiwi Prefab exhibition in Taranaki was outside Puki Ariki Museum, and there were 4 built housing projects that were demonstrated on the foreshore there, and they said that brought a whole nother level of clientele and families through their museum that they wouldn't normally have. Don't suppose anyone from Te Papa's in the room? No? Okay. So other demonstrations we've done are the Unipod, the world's first open source bathroom and kitchen pod. Would you believe it? You can download and make this yourself. It is also LifeMark and Homestar friendly, which means it is sustainable and will take you through your aging process. So really like Nirvana. So we should be making a lot more larger pieces and parts, essentially. Cool. So what does prefab look like today? Well, anything that's made off-site is prefabricated. In 95% of our new builds, we have pre-nailed roof trusses and wall frames, not particularly sexy, but we also have complete buildings. That's your kind of Keith Hay box that we've been doing those transportable since about the 1960s. But really, that's not really interesting. What we want to be looking at in the future is panels and pods, the stuff in the middle that we can learn from offshore. And why do we want to look at that stuff? Because it's much higher quality. When you build in controlled conditions, you can control the quality. You're building to tighter tolerances, you're using digitally fabricated machinery, and you're getting a better product. You're also importantly saving time. So if you're building up close, because of course we're not going to open up any more greenfield developments, you're going to be wanting to have less disruption, noise, and traffic, transport, dust, and any of the usual construction problems. Has anyone here done their own construction? Has anyone found that it took twice as long, cost twice as much? So one of the things about prefabrication and pre-planning is that you know your cost, your quality, and your timeframes. Importantly also, you also know your materials, and if you can plan and design accordingly, then you can design according to correct material widths and have much less wastage. What's important to realise though is that prefabrication does not mean little boxes of ticky-tacky. It does not mean standardised outcomes, because we're talking about mass customisation. We have this wonderful technology called the computer, which means that we can design different outcomes for different people, and the machines that produce the pieces and parts respond accordingly. Now, health and safety has had a huge focus in the New Zealand construction industry in the last few years, and importantly and locally here in Wellington, you might know the College of Creative Arts building at Massey University. Now, that building, the roof was made in pieces and parts at grade in the car park. So when those pieces were lifted into place, the workers were at height, I think, at 1/12 of the time. They saved a third of the cost and half the time. So when one guy walked off the end of a piece of the roof, he was only on a jig that was about 1 metre off the ground. So that was pretty good for him and pretty good for the health and safety rating on that one. The other, now I've just got 5 pictures that show those components and pieces and parts. So that's roof trusses and wall frames, in case you haven't seen those. Now, in terms of panels, this is really interesting. A factory in Christchurch. That's good, I'm talking great all day and then by now. Okay, so what we're doing here is basically New Zealand Standard 3604 production, only it's being made in a factory. So all these pieces and parts are made in a factory with about $15 million worth of German machinery, and then you install even the windows and doors when they're all in a hanging rack. They get, as you can see, they come to site all vertically stacked, and you can assemble a house in a couple of hours, an afternoon, and you've got a watertight structure. When you talk to other countries where this is standard construction, like Sweden or Germany, and you say, how do you guys deal with weather-tight issues? They just say, we don't know what you're talking about, lady. So clearly they're onto something that we're not quite aware of yet. There are other panel products that I think are particularly important for New Zealand, and these ones are used a lot in central Otago and central South Island for obvious reasons. It's a highly insulated, structural insulated panel. It's essentially like an Eskimo pie. So you've got an oriented strand board, insulation, oriented strand board sandwich. It's your structure and your interior lining if you want. Has anyone seen Grand Designs? You know that show? Okay, cool. So one of the houses on that show was in Nelson, and they just painted the interior black. You might have remembered that. They used these SIPS panels. And there's another wonderfully carbon-friendly, I hope this will work for you, Victor, timber product that New Zealand is the first place in the Southern Hemisphere to produce. It's called cross-laminated timber, or CLT. The construction industry loves its 3-letter acronyms. It's essentially like a giant plywood. So that's where you have boards that are then laminated at 90-degree angles. And then the pods, you know, we don't have a huge number of examples of this, but some of you might know this University of Auckland student accommodation building next to the motorway in Stanley Street in Auckland. What you might not know is it is made of 468 bedroom pods that were made in Matamata. Of course, that's where you go to buy pods. So they were stacked 3 levels high, and then an inter-story floor was poured. Now, this is another familiar and exemplary case of what you can do when you put a house on the waterfront. This was the First Lighthouse. Did anyone visit this about 2011? It was on Frank Kitts. You were one of about 20,000 people that lined up for 2 weeks to shake Newsboy's hand, get a coffee and walk through the house? Great. So this house went to the States for the solar decathlon competition. It went in about 5 containers, a mixture of pods or volumes, and then a panelised section through that dining area. Some of you would have been through that. And then we have a good old complete building. And this one I put up on purpose because this was like a little baby between 2 of our board members as a result of that Hive Home Innovation Village we did in Christchurch back in 2012 to 2014. So this is what I like to call affordable architecture. It's not an oxymoron, but it's what happens when you have a dedicated housing distributor like Keith Hay Homes marry a high-end architect like Andre Hodgkin from Architects. So this beautiful kind of 4-bedroom house, I think you could get for around 280, 300 at the time. So I was certainly very keen on that one. So I'm just going to whiz over this because I'm pretty sure you're not going to whip out your scissors and computer and start making one of these things. But essentially running a non-profit industry association, we put everything we know back onto our website. So under our resources, we just released last week at our conference 25 different case studies that show how to do prefab. I get a little bit upset when Kiwibuild and MHUD use one term and MB uses another. So we're trying to help people use the same terms because basically you could say prefab, off-site manufacture, modern methods of construction or MMC or OSM, and it all means the same thing. So pretty frustrating, but that's where we start. We've got a roadmap, a value case. Essentially, all we need to know now is if I want to do prefabrication, what does it save me? 15%. Material matrix is where do I get started? And importantly, when talking with council folks, it talks about the building code requirements. Basically, it's just to let you know there are places to go if you want to find out a bit more information. Now, this time last year, we ran our annual conference, the CoLab, and we said, ta-da, Kiwibuild, just in case you were thinking of purchasing offshore, we want to let you know that in New Zealand, we can make up to 7,000 housing units a year. And that sounded awesome, except that exactly 3 hours later, we'd had 3 more announcements from companies saying what they were going to produce. And so this year, when I did my highly untechnical analysis based on gossip and hearsay in the industry, it's looking more like 35,000 units can be built a year if everybody who says they're expanding does. So I think that producing is not the problem. Land, of course, is a core part of the problem, as is finance and building consenting. Now, these are the 3 areas, along with procurement at scale, that our members complain to me about. So these are the areas that we work in the most. And some of you might have seen last week when we ran our conference, Westpac announced a financing package they've got for transportable houses, which is one part of the answer, but going in the right direction. So something I left out the front there for anyone who grabbed it is, so this time last year we ran a design competition for a souped up granny flat, or a home in my backyard. And at first we did this with Auckland Council because we're very worried about all these poor Aucklanders that are asset rich but cash poor and can't afford to help their children get into homes. Now that was a great joke until about a month ago when our new rating valuations came out and we realised that we're fast turning into that Auckland situation as well. So we put this call out for folks to design, manufacture, and they also had to have in their team a student or an apprentice because of course we are totally on board with Minister Salisa's construction skills agenda, and these are the good folks we put it out with, of course, Auckland Council, Lifemark and Homestar, which is the Green Building Council, and we put it out and got 187 teams register, and that's round about when we thought, oh shit, we can't actually judge that many teams. So luckily 86 were eventually produced, and we managed to nail them down to 12. And really it doesn't matter if there's a winner or not, because what this is a pattern book. So you might be aware that the lovely villas and bungalows and the pictures that we surround ourselves with in Wellington are all made of pattern books. And so that's when you basically stood with your builder and chose your pieces and parts that got put together. Our railway houses were made like that, our hydro scheme houses were made like that as well. So we've put together these 12 ideas for a snug in your backyard, and hopefully this might provide an alternative to a retirement village if that's not your thing. So this is certainly one of the best renders, I think, because it shows exactly how you're going to have free childcare in your backyard for the next decade. And we know that not all Wellingtonians have got lovely flat backyards with drive-on car parks, so that's why there's a couple of two-storey options amongst other things in there. Which brings us to an interesting conversation about how we can use an example like this to create a conversation with our councils about our local planning in it. And so some of the things that I've come across is that in Dunedin, for example, there's obviously a high-end render of how your suburb will look. What some of the things I've found in Dunedin recently when we talked with their housing summit is they said, yeah, no, fine, we allow all these secondary dwellings, they just have to be for family members. Aha, well there's a small issue, isn't it? They're not really for everyone. And then a number of people who want to put one up in Wellington have said, oh, but we need an off-street car park on the back of the section. Oh, right, okay, that might be problematic. So one of the things we've also been finding about is in California, they've made some changes recently to enable people to do more of these snugs, we'll call them, but they call them accessory dwelling units. And they're enabling, if you're within a certain amount of distance to public transport, then you don't need to have a car park on site. And so they're finding that their applications for building consents for these dwellings is skyrocketing. So there's lots of ways to have these conversations. And of course, if we're really here to assist the Kiwi build development, then there could be a way to kind of Kiwi build stamp them, or a way that we can rent them to people who need who are on a lower median income. Clearly not a Wellington problem, we've heard, but just in case it was, then we could provide ways that rental situations can also help Housing New Zealand achieve some of their incredible numbers they need to reach. So yeah, some great examples out of California about how they are increasing their numbers of permits or building consents through changing some of their district planning rules. Now I'll just leave you with this one. Remember that lovely First Lighthouse that was on the waterfront at Frank Kitts? Well, the same team developed this wee one, the Flip Snug, which won our People's Choice Award, which was through very scrutinised social media judging. And this is one of the ones that we are working with the team at Wellington Council to see if we can demonstrate at a park near you. Let's just say it might be called Frank Kitts. So what we're really hoping to do is provide a way to get 2 or 3 of these really smart, so we're 35 to 65 square metres in living, and to start that conversation with our young people about really what they want to live in, with our older people about where you want to age in place, and also with our millennials who are not such fans of DIY, just strangely enough. Cool. So that's my last slide, summary. That's just so you know where to find us. By all means, grab one of these if they're still sitting out the front. And if you're not bored to tears, there's little postcards to fold up your own little snug. And there was just one other thing I was thinking early on. We were talking about digital transformation. Now, you may know that Google is right into property development now. Through their Alphabet entity, they've got something called Sidewalk Labs. So if you're interested in that, have a look. They're redeveloping the Toronto waterfront. So if you want to talk about data capture, it just blows your mind as to where exactly they're going to go with capturing. And their techniques are that mass timber, so that cross-laminated timber, and the large timber resources like, here's some more acronyms, LVL, laminated veneer lumber, and glulam, and things like that. So this is a lovely way to join up Minister Jones's 1 billion trees with some of our regional economic development and some of our housing provision. All good? No one interrupted me. No question. Cool.
Thanks, Grandma. Really exciting, and I think it just goes to show and prove that prefabrication doesn't mean low quality and low design outcomes. Really excited as well. I probably need to confirm and speed up the process to get the flip on to Frank Kitts Park. Otherwise, I'm going to lose a bet with the mayor, and I owe him a hamburger if I don't get it on there soon. So we'll have to keep working together there, Pamela.
Sounds good.
Any questions of Pamela? I'm conscious of time, but please
cool.
feel free to ask any questions. No, you've inspired. All right, our final speaker is Paul Ward, the founder of Capital Kiwi. So without further ado, Paul.
Do you want to come down and, just line up where the presentation is? Cheers. Sweet. Cheers. Thank you. Kia ora koutou, everyone. Ngā mihi o te rā. I think it is still rā outside. I'm Paul Ward, founder of Capital Kiwi. Just a quick straw poll. How many people here have seen a kiwi? And how many people have seen a kiwi in the wild? It's kind of about what we'd expect in an audience like this. So it's a sad fact probably that more international tourists than locals have encountered kiwi. If us Kiwis have seen our namesake, it's most likely in a zoo nocturnal house. We associate it with the back blocks of Northland or Rakiura Stewart Island, not a city. So why Wellington? Well, we've had Justin talk about the 90s in Wellington. When I was a teenager, growing up in Johnsonville and at high school and then university in Wellington, I didn't see many native birds. Probably the birds I saw most would be pigeons, sparrows and blackbirds. They're birds of the eaves and the underpasses. Native nature was somewhere you went somewhere else to experience, like Kapiti Island or a national park. On the back of spillover from Zealandia, plus council possum control and community-led efforts, we know this has changed dramatically. We've got kaka feeding on craft sugar water in Aro Valley. Tui, our most common bird with blackbirds now. We've got Kereru load testing power lines, and Kārearea are keeping politicians honest, dive bombing them above Ahumairangi, above the beehive. And there's even been nesting tieki, or saddleback, up the road in Pole Hill. Just to put that in perspective, this was the first time that tieki had nested in the wild on the mainland in 120 years. So in the 60s, they were on one island in the Hauraki Gulf. Now you can go, I think I'm pretty credible in saying this, that Wellington's the only place in the world you can go mountain biking with tieki. It's part of a changing of Wellington from what was described as a basket case for native biodiversity in the early 90s to a natural capital. These animals are now part of civic identity. This guy was the winner of a naming competition for a kaka nest behind Garage Project in Aro Valley, and the winner, Cortina, was for the bush bogan coming back to town. They provide us, these encounters in backyards and in town belts, provide us with in-your-face answers to why predator-free. And I'm going to play a little clip from a resident in Brooklyn.
What can you see? Where is it?
Sweet. Apparently that was, kaka was the second word that the young girl ever said. And the family that had come up from the South Island didn't know the difference between a kia and a kaka when they moved to Wellington, and they certainly do now. And again, kaka is another success story for Wellington. That bird's gone from being on the threatened species list 2 or 3 years ago to at-risk recoverings. And that wild population in Wellington, I think, is the 3rd biggest population of North Island kaka in New Zealand, in the North Island. So a couple of years ago at a community trapping session in Pole Hill, Justin was there with his kids. There was Paul Scratch Jansen, a Kiwi conservation veteran. We'd just been to visit one of those tieki nests in the wild, and the question was posed, what about Kiwi? Scratch, of course, answered straight away, said, yep, why not? So I'm just going to do a quick primer on Kiwi conservation so people can get a sense of what the issues are that this taonga faces. As far as New Zealand birds go, Kiwi are relatively robust. The adults have strong, stout legs and can fight off most predation threats, including stoats, possums, and most cats. Those legs give them a fend like Ma'anonu. If anyone's needing to be inspired before a match against the Aussies, sorry David, try YouTubing Kiwi versus Possum and you'll get to see those legs in action. Their eggs have design features going for them too, Pam. They're too big for a rat to get its mouth around. Where they get smashed is as juveniles, so it's in that space between hatching and getting up to fighting weight. So when they hit 1 kilo, that's when they can fight off those predators. Without pest control, their odds are pretty stark. Only 4 or 5% of chicks make it through to that fighting weight, to adulthood. That takes approximately 3 or 4 months for depending on species. When there's sufficient pest control, the graph goes upwards. As Scratch would say, you need to have more livestock than dead stock. So to put that in perspective, there's probably natural mortality is around 50 or 60%. The magic line that we need to get in order to have a growing population is to get that survival rate up to 19 or 20%. So it's shifting it from 1 in 20 birds up to 1 in 4 or 1 in 5. We've got a heap of success references where that's happening around the country, notably over the harbour in the Rongorongo Valley, where we did the pest control and worked with the community around things like the pig hunting community and the dog owning community. And there was, I think, 2 lots of Kiwi, I think 12 birds each were introduced about a decade ago, and there's 150 Kiwi now in the Rongorongo Valley. For those of you who don't know where that is, that's over behind Wainuiomata. So we've got people, residents of Wainuiomata in Sunny Grove, that go to bed at night with their own Goodnight Kiwi chorus. Another, probably the biggest place where Kiwi live alongside people is Whakatane or Hopi, and they've gone from 8 birds 11 or 12 years ago to over 300, so that's where that sign comes from. And most famously on Rakiura, Stewart Island. Is that going to autoplay? That's on Mason Bay Homestead. So on Rakiura, there's roughly 20,000 Kiwi, 400 people. The key difference between Rakiura and the mainland is they've never had mustelids on Stewart Island, so no stoats, weasels or ferrets. And if you go down to Oban, there's probably more Kiwi beak marks on the rugby field than sprig marks. They see Kiwi wandering around on the golf course and in people's backyards. So that's a kind of a vision of what's achievable. So the next thing we needed to look at was habitat. Kiwi aren't super fussy. They'll flip over cowpats on farms. They live in alpine tussock, duneland and forestry. The scrubby Manuka gorsey hillsides of Wellington's southwest, which we can see looking over Meridian Westwind here, is basically Kiwi country. So the next thing we needed was landowner support. The minimum requirement for a Kiwi habitat area is 10,000 hectares. So we went out and talked to the big landowners. Te Rāwhiti Station is 5,000 hectares. We had a whole heap of woolshed hui, church hall meetings, pawa fritters, bone-crushing fishermen's handshakes, and farmhouse cuppers. And everyone we talked to was supportive of the concept. So we had a potential kohanga for Kiwi. So the next challenge we faced was finding funding for the project. And at the end of 2017, Predator Free 2050 Limited, how many people have heard of Predator Free 2050? Everyone here? So it's the ambitious goal to get rid of those key predators for our taonga, which is rats, possums and mustelids. And Predator-Free 2050 Limited was set up by the last government and continued by this government to fund the big pieces of the jigsaw puzzle towards achieving that goal. So Capital Kiwi put in a pitch along with Predator-Free Wellington. Predator-Free Wellington's looking at getting rid of rats, possums and mustelids from Miramar Peninsula. So we kind of pitched, and we were asked to submit a joint RFP. So we submitted that Capital Kiwi would be working at landscape scale on the western front. Military metaphors are kind of terrible when you're talking about this stuff. And Predator-Free Wellington will be working on urban eradication, and we were successful in receiving that funding. We described the pitch as Wellington United. So this is the pest-free kick wall up at Pole Hill, where kids lose points for hitting a native species, and you get points for hitting a predator. So it's kind of a cheeky way of getting bored parents to think about it while they're watching their kids play soccer. It's a 5-year project. We're 1 year into it. After 3 years of eliminating the stoat threat, we can start talking about Kiwi. So how? 4,400 traps over 23,000 hectares of private and public land. 90% of the project area is private landowners. To put this in scale, it's a similar size to, if you look up to the right-hand side of the picture, that's State Highway 1 running down from Porirua down to Ngāranga. It's a similar size to Abel Tasman National Park or Resolution Island down in Fiordland. That means that there's a trap every 5.3 hectares, which is the density model that has been successfully used to eradicate stoats from the Fiordland Islands. So this is the first time it's been deployed at scale on the mainland. The initial trap deployment is a 2-to-1 mix of local export success, Good Nature's self-resetting A24s. That's one of those traps there. If people want to talk about the traps later on, we can, but their factory's based in Newtown. They're exporting to 19 different countries, and the key feature of this trap is that it remains active to catch prey, whereas an old-fashioned trap, which we'll see in a second, once there's an animal caught in the trap, it has to be manually cleared. One in every 3 traps is called a DOC 250, and that's one of those old spring traps. And the reason for those traps in the network is in case ferrets come back into the Wellington landscape. So ferrets would be a risk for adult kiwi. At the moment, there aren't any ferrets in Wellington, and the closest they're catching them is Waikanae, which is 50 or 60 k's to the north. This is an image of the two project areas. The core area, stage 1, is where we'll be looking Te Rāwhiti Station, Kinol, the West Wind wind farm up there to the north, and then we've got Te Kopaho, which is the big, about 500 hectares of council reserve down by Owhiro Bay. That's just under 11,000 hectares, and the second stage of the project is a buffer zone to prevent reinvasion. So the ultimate vision is Kiwi wandering beneath the wind turbine on our Mount Koko for tourist snaps, to have residents of Karori and Island Bay going to sleep at night with their own Goodnight Kiwi chorus. To have images like this augmented by Kiwi calling. But we've got a bit of work to get on with first, but we know it's doable because it's been done. This is on one of the ridges on Te Rāwhiti Station looking across to Te Waipounamu, the South Island. That's not a bad office, eh? The progress to date. In November at Te Rāwhiti Station, Kinol Station, Macra Farm and Westwind, we've deployed nearly 1,000 traps. It took us a week. One thing to emphasise is the accessibility in our project area compared to somewhere like Fiordland Island is enormous. Meridian and Transpower have done us a huge favour. I think in that 11,000 hectares, we only had to get out and walk, out of the 4-wheel drive and walk, I think, for 200 metres of that project area. So we've got, I won't stick with the kill pictures too long, but we've got stoats on the left, 3 weasels in the middle, an enormous Norway rat to the far right, and I'm not sure what the one on the far right is. I'll pause that for a second. So by winter 2019, we'll have the whole network out. So that's 4,400 traps over 23,000 hectares. It'll be the largest trap-focused stoat project in New Zealand, and it's completely community-owned and run. So to get a sense of that spirit, I'm just going to play this short promo.
It's awesome to see everyone here. This is the start of a 5-year project to bring Kiwi back to the wild in Wellington.
So here we are at part of the launch for Capital Kiwi.
Exciting to be here and part of this amazing project, and yeah, we're really keen to get involved further as this goes along.
We've been racing, I guess, to get to a point where we can start to deploy the traps, and to get sort of a 10 days notice and get 70 people to turn up, I think that's fantastic.
We all come from different sectors in the community, and so this kind of project which pulls us all together is great.
I feel like it will be good because then they won't get extinct.
I think it's great. It's really nice to see people work together and get to know each other and all do something really good.
You know, we need to give back to the land, and to do it with people that share similar beliefs. It's awesome.
Tēnā kia mihi kia koutou, mō koutou I whakai kia whakaritea tēnei kaupapa I tēnei rangi. Tēnei anō hoki te mihi atu kia koutou katoa e ōku rangatira, ko taranaki whānui ki te upoko o te ite tēnei, e mihi kauake nei kia koutou katoa, kia ora koutou.
So we're at Te Rāwhiti Station, 5,000 hectares. It's basically the southwest corner of the North Island, and we're launching Capital Kiwi, and that's the mission to bring back our taonga, to bring back our namesake to the wild in Wellington. We are looking at 4,400 traps over 23,000 hectares.
It's absolutely amazing to be here today, see the first traps being laid out on the ground here at Te Rāwhiti Station, and really the project to bring back our namesake, the Kiwi, to Wellington.
It's going to be a huge community effort, no doubt hundreds if not thousands of people being involved, and hopefully in 3 to 5 years time we're going to see Kiwi right back here in Wellington.
The significance of today is we're starting a long-term vision, and that's about getting Kiwi back onto our whenua.
And probably most importantly, the community of Wellington has shown that they're ready to live with our manu mates again. We've got kaka back in our backyards, we've got tui dripping off flax bushes. Kiwi really, for all that predator-free work, would be the icing on the cake.
So we had not too many OSH risks with that launch, with 90-year-old Ted and an 8-year-old kid banging in the traps. Ted actually gave us probably what's been our kaupapa behind the project. He gave us the slogan. He was surrounded by journalists, and the quote that came out in the newspapers was, if we can't look after our namesake, we deserve to be renamed idiots. So in Wellington, we're in a unique position. When we get to engage with our manu taonga, it makes us realise why they and we are special. When we hear a tui chortling in our backyard, like I was this morning, with its 2 voice boxes, we realise why our music awards are called the tuis. When you see a demon grasshopper wetter in your woodpile under a rotting tree stump, you can see why our world-leading film effects company is called Wetter Effects. And how, you know, we're Kiwis. It's Tāne Mahuta's #1 taonga. Like the birds, we're shy, tough, and just a little bit odd. And the other thing I was thinking about is we both only sing at night, probably. It wasn't the Stoats that beat the Aussies in the Rugby League last year, and it wasn't a possum with a lazy coming out of its eye. That was the people's choice in the flag debate. And I was thinking, Pam, as you were talking about Kiwi Build and Kiwibank, we'll have to rename these institutions Rat Build and Rat Bank. And on a more poignant note, it was the image of a Kiwi shedding a tear that resonated in our hearts and our Manawa following last Friday's tragic events. Kiwi are a key part of who we are and of our sense of meaning and our place in the world. In New Zealand, with our found nowhere else on planet Earth examples of island evolution, we face a pretty straightforward choice, really. It's stand back and watch the predators we brought with us wipe out our taonga and native biodiversity, or do something about it. And on the back of Zealandia spillover and community kaitiaki efforts and council support over generations, Wellington is leading the way in the doing something about it. These 2 kids are giving the Capital Kiwi salute, which is 3 fingers for the kiwi foot, when we were at an event with Taranaki Whānui up at Zealandia, their Machu Soames Kaitiaki, Therese was, she'd just been doing a workshop on sign language, and the sign for Wellington is also 3 fingers, but like this for the wind. This is the future vision for our capital, bringing Kiwi back to the people. Capital Kiwi's on the way to making this into reality. So yeah, kia ora, go Capital Kiwi.
Thank you, Paul. What an inspiring, ambitious program. I actually have the benefit of enjoying the return of the tui, the kaka, and the kararu. I enjoy living in Wadestown, literally only a 10-minute e-bike ride from my home to work, but I feel like I'm in the middle of wildlife. It is absolutely inspiring, and love to see for the first time Kiwi in the wild. It'd be great to see. Any questions of Paul? You have clearly inspired.
Sweet.
So thank you. Just wrapping. One question here. Thank you.
How do we get involved, Paul?
So, okay, all the boring usual stuff. Follow it on Facebook and Instagram. Go to capitalkiwi.co.nz to find out or to contact us. Probably the key thing you can do at the moment is get trapping in your backyard or join a reserve group. So have a look for Predator Free Wellington has links to, I think there's every suburb except for Kelburn, bizarrely. If anyone's from Kelburn, get moving. Has a backyard or reserved trapping group happening. So,
fantastic.
Yeah.
And thanks, Pamela, for your question as well. Just before I thank our speakers, I am conscious of time. I just want to do a little bit of a wrap-up of where we are from here. So as I said, this is the second of a 3-part speaker series. Last week's speaker series was all about the changing technology and what that might mean to the future of our cities. Today was very much about planning for that growth, those decisions and those trade-offs we need to consider, whether we look at greenfield opportunities versus infill, how the quality of our housing stock versus the quantity of housing stock might be achieved, what those numbers actually mean, and importantly, how do we return ourselves back to nature and appreciate all that we have and what makes Wellington great. Next week's speaker series is all about ensuring what we do is for us. We need to be a part of this. This is about planning for the people, not just now, but also for the future. So next week's speaker series is all about planning for people, designing for people, and encourage you either, if you're not going to be able to make it, spread the word, get online. So planning for growth on the Wellington City Council website, get online. In mid-April, we are going to be releasing a series of scenarios that start to tackle this question of where we're going to accommodate growth. Please understand they are not solutions, but they are scenarios which start to try and get us to understand, us, all of us, to understand what trade-offs, what considerations, what questions, what policy moves we need to make as a community for this growing city. Finally, can I please have a final round of applause for our wonderful speakers tonight, Liz, Victor, Pamela and Paul as well. I do have a small kohar to give to each of our speakers tonight, but until next week, please jump online, please get involved, please sign up because there will be regular updates as well. But until then, have a great night. Kia ora.